On May 12, 1956, the car slammed straight into a telephone pole after a party in Beverly Hills. When they pulled Montgomery Clift from behind the wheel, the face once considered one of Hollywood's most perfect had been deformed beyond recognition. Blood, broken teeth, shattered bones. Everything fused into a single moment that should never have been allowed to happen to a star at the height of his fame. And more terrifying still, it was not the beginning of the tragedy, but merely the first moment the public was able to see it. Before that, he was a completely new kind of leading man, fragile, tense, deeply internal, forcing all of Hollywood to rethink what a man on screen could be. But behind those eyes that captivated audiences was a life split in two, a true self kept hidden, and an image constructed in order to survive. The more successful he became, the wider that gap grew. The more he was adored, the more he had to remain silent. This is not the story of a star who collapsed after an accident. This is the story of a man who had begun to fracture long before his car struck that pole on that night. A rare talent, a life restrained, and a journey in which every step forward pulled him closer to disappearance. That fracture did not appear overnight. It had been forming much earlier, from the very moment Montgomery Clift first cried out on October 17, 1920, in Omaha, Nebraska. A beginning that seemed complete, yet carried none of the sense of safety a child needs. He was born into a wealthy family, but that wealth came with invisible pressures. His father, a successful Wall Street broker, existed like a rigid, closed system where emotion had little room. Meanwhile, his mother tried to construct a different world, a world built on an imagined aristocratic lineage where she believed her children had to live, speak, and exist as if they belonged to a class higher than reality. Clift's childhood was not tied to any specific place. Before he could form a sense of belonging, he was already forced to leave. And the family constantly moved between America and Europe. His education did not take place in classrooms with peers his own age, but in private rooms with tutors, where knowledge was selectively delivered, separated from the ordinary rhythm of other children's lives. He could speak multiple languages, understand different cultures, yet lacked relationships that lasted long enough to become memories. Every place he arrived at carried a sense of impermanence, and every departure left no clear ending. The constantly shifting environments made any sense of stability nearly non-existent. Even small incidents left deeper marks than usual. When he was very young, during a trip on a ship, another child once held his head underwater in a swimming pool until he could no longer breathe. His throat was severely injured and required surgery afterward. The long scar left on his neck was not only a physical trace, but a quiet marker of experiences that were never named. Things that happened quickly, without explanation, then disappeared along with the places left behind. The sudden changes following the economic crisis did not only overturn material life, but also expose the emptiness of what had once been constructed as an unchangeable reality. The family had to leave behind their familiar way of living and step into a simpler environment, where images of status and origin could no longer keep everything in its previous place. The rules once maintained by material conditions began to lose their foundation, and at the same time, the sense of a stable structure gradually became uncertain. In that unclear transition, Montgomery Clift had few choices that felt like direction. What had once been arranged no longer functioned fully, yet no new order had clearly taken its place. His step onto the stage at a very young age did not come as a calculated decision, but rather like a natural response to a world that had changed too quickly. There, under the lights and within movements that were clearly defined, he experienced for the first time a space where he did not have to adapt to pre-existing images, but could exist in a state he controlled, where each role became a way to reach genuine emotion instead of continuing to live within pre-constructed patterns. Montgomery Clift entered the world of theater at a very young age, and within just a few years, he appeared on the Broadway stage, a space never meant for children still trying to understand themselves. There, he was no longer part of constant movement or family expectations, but became an actor responsible for every gesture, every pause, every glance before an audience. That space gradually extended into years of continuous work on stage, where Montgomery Clift was no longer a young face experimenting, but became part of a demanding environment that required near absolute precision. From the mid-1930s to the late 1940s, he appeared regularly on Broadway, working with directors who were not easy to compromise with, and co-stars who had long since established their own styles. Each role was not an opportunity for quick impression, but a prolonged process in which every gesture had to be controlled, every pause had to have a reason to exist. There was no room for safety, nor for relying on external image. Everything had to be built from an internal state, deep enough to sustain the character's structure, even when nothing remarkable was happening on the surface. Within that rhythm of work, his approach to the craft became increasingly clear. He did not seek easily recognizable roles, but was drawn to complex characters, where emotion could not be explained directly, but had to be held back, restrained, and only revealed in very small moments. His near-total focus on the inner dimension made the preparation process extended, sometimes tense, as he continuously adjusted how the character thought and reacted until everything reached a convincing state. It was no longer about completing a role, but about discovering another way of existing within his own body. Meanwhile, from the other side, offers from cinema began to appear with increasing frequency. Hollywood opened a clearer path toward fame and financial success, but it came with a tightly structured system where actors were placed into tested molds, directed according to market demands, and required to maintain a stable image across multiple projects. He did not step into that path, not because of a lack of opportunity, but because he refused to trade his way of working to fit into a pre-existing structure. The refusals repeated over many years, even as his contemporaries gradually moved to the screen and quickly became familiar to the public. The tension between these two modes of operation, on one side, the system's demand for control, and on the other, the individual's need to retain decision-making power, began to take clear shape during this period. He did not want to be fixed into a specific type of role, did not want to be guided by pre-calculated choices, and certainly did not want to lose the ability to shape each character in his own way. Demands such as choosing the director, selecting the script, or rejecting unsuitable projects at that time were nearly non-existent for an actor without standing in cinema. Yet they became principles he held on to. It was precisely within that persistence that a very different foundation began to form. Not based on familiarity with the audience, but on the ability to sustain an acting method that was not easily replaceable. And when he entered cinema, he did not appear as someone new who needed to adapt, but as someone who already knew exactly what he would do and what he would not do, carrying with him an approach distinct enough to force everything around him to adjust accordingly. Offers from Hollywood came very early, as soon as Montgomery Clift began to attract attention on stage in the late 1930s. But for nearly a decade afterward, he consistently turned them down. Not because he lacked ambition, but because what he saw in that system ran counter to the way he was building his craft. The long-term contracts that required actors to appear in multiple films each year, roles assigned in advance, images that had to remain consistent for audience recognition, all of it formed a mechanism in which the person behind the role was gradually replaced by a repeatable mold. He was not willing to enter a place where every important decision was made from the outside. The shift did not come from a sudden impulse. but formed gradually as he realized that cinema, if approached in a way true to himself, could open a different kind of space. No longer confined to the rhythm of stage performance, the camera allowed for the preservation of the smallest movements, the almost imperceptible reactions, exactly what he had been pursuing for years. By the mid-1940s, when his position on Broadway had become secure, he began to reconsider. It was not about moving to Hollywood to become a star, but about testing whether his way of acting could exist within a larger system, on the condition that he did not have to surrender control. That is why, when he agreed to enter film in 1948, everything came with conditions that were highly unusual for a newcomer. He did not sign long-term binding contracts. I did not accept being cast according to predetermined plans and retained the right to refuse if a project was not suitable. This decision puzzled many in the industry, even caused discomfort, because it ran against the way the system operated at the time. But for him, it was not a compromise. It was a way to protect what had taken nearly 10 years to build, the ability to exist within a role without being shaped from the outside. When he appeared in Red River, it was not the beginning of a newcomer, but the continuation of a process already refined. The character he portrayed did not carry the certainty and dominance audiences were used to seeing in leading men of that era. Standing alongside John Wayne, the contrast was unmistakable. One side embodied power, command, and control. The other hesitation, interiority, and incomplete reactions. During production, this was not always easily accepted. Scenes stretched longer than expected as he continually adjusted the way the character existed, preserving silences that others might have wanted to fill. But when the film was released and achieved major commercial success, those very details set him apart. Not because he fit in, but because he resembled no one who had come before. Also in 1948, And The Search was released and became the film that earned him his first Academy Award nomination. His role as an American soldier in a post-war setting was not built through grand actions, but through his restraint, by holding emotion in rather than projecting it outward. Audiences did not see a hero in the conventional sense, but a man trying to hold himself together in a world that had just been shattered. The nomination was not only recognition, but also placed him in a rare position, a newcomer to cinema who was already being regarded as a center of change. He continued with The Heiress in 1949, a film entirely different in space and rhythm. This time, he stood opposite Olivia de Havilland in a story that left almost no room for overt expression. The character he portrayed was not constructed to be likable, nor to provide a stable anchor for the audience. Its fascination lay in the inability to clearly determine motive. A glance could be sincere, but could just as easily be calculated. A line could carry emotion, but could also be a deliberate move. During filming, his constant adjustments to the character's existence, from speech to posture to the rhythm of reaction, repeatedly extended production time as he refused to accept a version that had not reached the state he envisioned. When the film was completed, the role brought him another Academy Award nomination, but at the same time clarified something further. He was not concerned with whether a character was liked, but whether it was real. That difference did not stop at drawing attention. It began to take clearer shape when Montgomery Clift stepped into a role from which nothing could return to the way it had been before. In 1951, when A Place in the Sun was made, he was not only facing a larger opportunity, but also a more tightly controlled production structure, where every movement of an actor was pre-calculated. The character of George Eastman that he portrayed was neither a hero nor a clearly defined villain. It was a man stretched between ambition and emotion, between what he wanted to become and what he could not escape. Clift's approach to the character was not based on explanation, but on withholding, holding back hesitations, empty spaces, incomplete reactions, allowing the audience to feel the tension unfolding on their own. Standing opposite Elizabeth Taylor, and the contrast did not lie in image, but in emotional rhythm. Taylor brought clarity, a kind of light that his character constantly reached toward, but could never hold. Within that distance, the scenes became tense in a way that was difficult to perceive with the naked eye. He did not accept repeating an emotion simply because the camera was ready. Each take was a search for a different state, more precise, more truthful. That approach extended the production process, as scenes that seemed complete were held back for further adjustment. Following prearranged blocking became difficult because he did not want to move according to marks, but wanted emotion to determine the character's rhythm. When the film was released, the audience's response did not come from grand moments, but from what existed between them. Glances that lingered longer than necessary, silences that made the air feel heavier. The box office rose sharply. The film became a major success, and the role earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. But what remained was not the numbers or the recognition, but the sense that a different way of acting had emerged, one that did not need to push emotion outward to prove its existence. What he did in that film did not only make the character more real, but also made what had once been considered correct in acting begin to feel insufficient. That performance rhythm did not end with a single success. It continued to be pushed further when Montgomery Clift appeared in From Here to Eternity. This time, and there were no private spaces or subtle tensions, but a rigid military structure where every action was clearly defined. The character Prewitt, a bugler who refuses to box at the request of his superiors, stood outside the established order from the very beginning. But Clift did not build the character through overt defiance. He did not turn Prewitt into a rebel in the conventional sense, but held on to silence, a nearly stubborn persistence, allowing what was suppressed to surface through small reactions, through each quiet but irreversible refusal. During production, the tension did not exist only within the script. Recreating the military environment required a high level of accuracy, with military advisors involved to ensure every detail met standard protocol. But Clift did not fully accept that approach. He adjusted the way the character moved, the way he responded to orders, preserving moments of hesitation that a proper soldier might not be allowed to show. Those adjustments did not always align with the original staging, leading to repeated takes in order to find a balance between technical demands and the internal state he was pursuing. The difference did not lie in breaking the rules, but in questioning those rules through the very way the character existed. When the film was released at the end of 1953, the response went beyond a typical positive reception. That From Here to Eternity became a major phenomenon, drawing wide audiences and winning 8 Academy Awards, solidifying its place in the popular culture of the time. The role brought Clift another Oscar nomination, but what stayed with viewers longer lay in the way the character was pushed into situations with no clear escape. Prewitt was not built as a winner, nor was he rescued from the pressures closing in around him. Clift allowed the character to reach his limits, where persistence brought no reward, but only intensified the collisions. And within those collisions, another image of a man began to emerge. Not one who controlled circumstances, but one being slowly worn down by them. Just as everything seemed to have fallen into place, commercial success, consecutive Oscar nominations, a solid position in the eyes of the audience, Montgomery Clift's choices began to move in a direction no one could have predicted. Projects that could have reinforced his standing, even elevated him further within the system, appeared one after another, then disappeared from his list of choices. Sunset Boulevard, Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, High Noon, East of Eden, or On the Waterfront. Each title carried the potential to reshape an actor's career towards something more stable and recognizable. But for him, those roles carried a different risk. Being fixed into a repeatable image, a type of character the audience would continue to seek from him, rather than forcing him to change. It was not only a professional matter, and these choices also touched a more sensitive territory. Some roles carried elements that could expose his private life, layers of meaning he did not want to explain before the public. In a system that constantly sought to connect on-screen image with the person, off-screen, maintaining distance became a form of self-protection. Each refusal did not create a major collision, but gradually accumulated into a clear deviation, where the path opening ahead was narrowed by his own hand, step by step, even as he was fully aware of the value of those opportunities. Alongside these choices, his way of working became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the industry's rhythm. The script was not a fixed entity. He continuously adjusted dialogue to better fit the character's state, sometimes altering the rhythm of an entire scene. Directions from the director were not always kept intact, as he sought to shift position, change reactions, preserve silences that the original structure had not anticipated. The presence of his acting coach, Rostova, was not merely supportive, but became an inseparable part of the process through which he built his roles, often making those around him feel pushed out of positions of control. Scenes extended beyond schedule. Production timelines stretched as he refused to stop at a version that had not reached the state he believed was right. And in the eyes of those working with him, his image gradually became sharply two-sided. On one side was the ability to create moments no one else could replicate, glances, small reactions that could alter the entire perception of a scene. On the other was an unpredictability, where nothing guaranteed that things would proceed according to plan. The tension did not erupt into open conflict, but existed in each adjustment, each delayed decision, each effort to keep the process from slipping off course. And between those two sides, he continued to move in his own way, holding on to a standard not easily compromised, even as it began to change how the system perceived him. The accumulating tensions no longer lay only in role choices or working methods, but suddenly became a visible fracture on a night in May 1956, when Montgomery Clift left a party at Elizabeth Taylor's home and his car crashed straight into a telephone pole on a dark road. That moment happened quickly, without preparation, but its consequences stretched for many years afterward. When he was pulled from behind the wheel, the face that had once been inseparable from his screen image was completely shattered. Jaw broken, nose crushed, facial bones displaced, deep cuts that required multiple consecutive surgeries. The process of recovery was not merely about reconstructing what had been lost, but about adapting to a body that no longer responded in the same way. The altered facial structure made each expression harder to control, and the subtle movements he had once relied on to build characters no longer functioned with the same precision. His voice was affected, part of his mouth lost flexibility, and prolonged pain forced him to rely on medication to maintain a working state. The drugs that initially served to reduce pain gradually became a daily necessity, combined with alcohol to ease the voids his body could no longer regulate on its own. When he returned to work, what appeared before the camera was no longer the same as before. In Raintree County, the difference became clear between scenes shot before and after the accident. A familiar face interrupted by changes that could not be fully concealed, despite adjustments in lighting and camera angles. Scenes took longer to complete, not because of a lack of ability, but because he had to rediscover how emotion could pass through a body that had been altered. The silences that had once been his strength became harder to sustain, as pain and fatigue seeped into every small reaction. This change did not exist only on a technical level. it directly affected the position he held. The image of the leading man, a central figure with a complete and flawless appearance, no longer aligned with how he appeared on screen. Projects had to adjust to accommodate his condition, production timelines were extended, and maintaining schedules became more difficult. Those who once saw him as a reliable choice began to hesitate, not because his talent had diminished, but because everything around him no longer operated with the steady rhythm the system required. From that point on, each appearance no longer carried the same continuity as before. Instead, it became a series of efforts to hold on to what could still be controlled, while other parts gradually slipped out of reach. The roles that followed did not lose their depth, but had to exist under different conditions, where body, emotion, and working environment were no longer aligned on the same axis as they once had been. That shift did not make him disappear immediately, but stretched into a difficult-to-grasp period, where Montgomery Clift continued to appear on screen, still retained his depth of performance, yet everything around him began to operate at a different rhythm. By the late 1950s, he returned with The Young Lions, 1958, standing alongside major names such as Marlon Brando in a large-scale war film with a clear narrative pace. His character was no longer the center of transformation, but existed as a quiet counterpoint, where emotion was held back rather than expressed. But the working process was no longer as fluid as before. Shooting days extended, scenes had to be repeated multiple times as he struggled to find a way to maintain rhythm between pain and prolonged exhaustion. In 1959, suddenly, last summer placed him in a more confined space, where everything revolved around memory and what was concealed. Standing once again with Elizabeth Taylor, he no longer moved much on screen, but allowed fragility to emerge through the way the character existed, almost trapped within his own speech. Scenes no longer relied on absolute precision as before, but sometimes had to be adjusted to fit the state he was able to sustain at that moment. His dependence on medication and alcohol could no longer be entirely hidden. It seeped into the working rhythm, into the way he entered a scene, into the way he left it. Wild River, 1960, continued to show another version, more subdued, less mobile, as if everything had been compressed inward. By The Misfits, 1961, the atmosphere on set became heavy in a way difficult to define. And not only him, but those around him also carried signs of exhaustion, making each scene an effort to keep everything from slipping out of control. There were moments when he could not fully remember his lines, relying on support from those around him to maintain rhythm. Yet, in those imperfect moments, something else emerged. A truth that could not be recreated by technique, when fragility was no longer an acting choice, but a real state unfolding directly in front of the camera. This reached a particular point in Judgment at Nuremberg, where he appeared only in a very short supporting role, almost contained within a single segment. When the character entered the courtroom, there was no long preparation, no clearly structured build as before. He stood there, his voice not entirely steady, his body carrying signs of fatigue, and each answer seemed to pass through an invisible barrier before being spoken. But it was precisely that state that made the performance unforgettable. There was no longer a clear boundary between acting and the real person, no longer absolute control, yet every small detail carried a weight that longer scenes could not achieve. The role earned him his 4th Academy Award nomination, but what remained longer was the sense that even in a brief moment, and he could still alter the entire atmosphere of a film. The pressures that accumulated from work did not find a clear stopping point in his personal life, where for Montgomery Clift, a family structure in the conventional sense never formed. There was no recorded wedding, no relationship formalized through marriage, no children, and no stable life to anchor to his public image. In a period when Hollywood almost assumed that every male star would be accompanied by a clear family narrative, that absence was not a minor detail, but became a void filled with speculation and explanations that were never complete. In the early years of his film career, he had a more visible relationship with Phyllis Thaxter, someone who had worked with him and appeared in the same social circles accessible to the press. Their closeness was noted in the late 1940s, when he was beginning to gain wider recognition. But that connection did not develop into a long-term structure. There was no engagement, no plan to build a family, and no clearly announced ending. It gradually receded as other pressures in his life became more pronounced. By 1951, when working with Elizabeth Taylor, another form of connection emerged, lasting over many years and not fitting into familiar definitions. They met during the filming of A Place in the Sun, and from the first days of working together, that connection carried an unusual quality. It was not a relationship leading to marriage, nor did it follow the trajectory of a publicly declared romance, but existed as a form of mutual reliance during times when both were under pressure from work and public attention. After the 1956 accident, her presence in the earliest hours when he was pulled from the car and taken to the hospital was not only a response to an emergency, but became a marker of the depth of their bond. In the years that followed, she continued to appear during his most difficult periods, not in a formally defined role, but as someone who kept things from completely slipping out of control. Alongside that connection, during the 1950s, he had a relationship with Libby Holman, a stage artist with a strong personality and a turbulent personal life. They met within the artistic environment and quickly formed an emotionally close bond. This relationship did not unfold publicly in the way Hollywood expected, but was deep enough to influence his choices during certain periods. There was no clearly marked beginning tied to a specific event, nor a defined ending, but it existed as a parallel current to what was happening in his work, where both found in each other a sense of understanding for the pressures they were facing. On the other side of what could be seen, his relationships with men existed in a space almost entirely separate from the public. Names such as Jerome Robbins or William Lemessena appear in biographies and memoirs, associated with periods that lasted for years, where he maintained connections that could not be made public. With Robbins, the bond is noted to have lasted around 2 years, while with Lemessena, the relationship extended longer, about 3 years, existing under conditions that both had to keep private. Connections with Roddy McDowall and Jack Larson are also mentioned in biographical sources, but were never confirmed in the way a public relationship might be understood. In a context where any deviation from the norm could lead to direct consequences for a career, keeping these parts of his life hidden was not simply a personal choice, but a condition for continuing to exist within the system. As a result, these relationships had no opportunity to develop into stable structures, no possibility of being acknowledged or protected. They existed within specific periods, within private spaces, and ended when surrounding conditions no longer allowed them to continue. The relationships that existed within those two separate spaces were not merely personal matters, but were drawn directly into the way Hollywood constructed and managed image. For Montgomery Clift, not marrying and not building a family life, according to conventional standards, made him a difficult case for studios to control. In the context of the late 1940s and early 1950s, the image of a male actor was not only built on screen, but had to be reinforced through private life, public appearances with women, visible relationships sufficient to create a sense of normalcy before the audience. When that did not form naturally, the system began to intervene in its own way. Meetings were arranged, appearances alongside actresses or carefully selected social figures were orchestrated, creating a layer of image clear enough for the press to exploit without touching what needed to remain hidden. Connections such as with Phyllis Thaxter in the early period, or the closeness with Elizabeth Taylor later on, were, in the public eye, easily placed into the familiar framework of a male-female relationship. But beneath that constructed layer, the most essential parts of his life did not lie there. His connections with men could not step into the light, could not be spoken of, and could not exist as an official part of his life. Two layers of reality began to form clearly, one performed, one concealed, and the distance between them became increasingly difficult to close. This tension was not only a vague feeling, and at certain moments, it surfaced as concrete events. In 1949, one night near Times Square, he was detained by police on allegations related to seeking another man, an act that, at that time, could have ended an entire career in a single moment. The incident did not spread to the public in the usual way. His management company intervened quickly. The charges were suppressed before becoming major news, and he continued to appear on screen as if nothing had happened. But that silence did not erase what had occurred. It merely shifted the incident from a public scandal into a secret that many within the industry knew but did not speak of. From that point on, a different kind of pressure began to emerge, no longer coming from roles or production schedules, but from the risk that what was hidden could be exposed at any moment. Threats, insinuations, the possibility of having his private life revealed became an unspoken but constant presence beneath every decision. Maintaining two parallel lives was no longer a choice, but a condition required to continue existing within the system. What was seen and what was actually happening were not only different, but at times moved in completely opposite directions, creating a form of conflict with no clear point of resolution, seeping into every stage of his life. The tension that had built over the years did not disappear after each project, but gradually accumulated into a state that was increasingly difficult to balance, where everything began to drift away from its familiar course. As the early 1960s began, Montgomery Clift was no longer facing isolated clashes between individual and system, but a process in which the two could no longer find common ground. His role in Freud. The secret passion appeared as an opportunity to return to the kind of deeply internal character he had performed best. But it was precisely there that all the accumulated conflicts began to surface clearly. The working rhythm was no longer stable, scenes stretched out, concentration fractured day by day. What had once been flexibility in his approach now became difficult to control, as his physical and mental state could no longer maintain the same rhythm as the film's demands. In that process, the difference between him and John Huston did not remain at the level of working methods, but turned into a prolonged confrontation. One side required precision to maintain the structure of the film, the other continually adjusted according to emotion at the moment of shooting, forcing each scene to search for balance from the beginning. As the schedule extended, costs rose, everything moved beyond acceptable limits, and for the first time, the issue was no longer resolved internally. Universal brought the matter into legal action, a step that showed how much the relationship between him and the system had changed. Although the lawsuit did not turn into a prolonged public battle, what it left behind was enough to shape how the industry viewed him in the years that followed. From that point on, the silence began to replace the invitations that had once come regularly. There was no official announcement that he had been excluded from Hollywood, but major projects no longer sought him out, and suitable roles were no longer offered. His name began to appear alongside cautionary labels, difficult to control, uninsurable, and in a system that operated on certainty that was enough to make producers step back. Plans that had not yet fully formed were halted from the outset, as in the case of Reflections in a Golden Eye. a project once mentioned but never realized with him. This change did not occur as a clear collapse, but rather like a gradual withdrawal from the center. His appearances became sparse, no longer forming a continuous rhythm as before. He still retained his way of acting, still pursued the same precision in emotion, but there was no longer an environment willing to adjust to accommodate it. What had once allowed him to stand apart from the system was no longer an advantage, but became a gap that could not be bridged, as the surrounding structure no longer opened itself to receive him. The silence that enveloped his final years did not arrive suddenly, but gradually took shape through the increasingly long gaps between his appearances. Montgomery Clift withdrew to New York, living in a private space that few were allowed to enter. There were no longer dense shooting schedules, no premieres, and no public appearances. The rhythm of his life slowed in a way that was almost detached from the world that had once revolved around him. Days passed within familiar rooms, where time was no longer divided by production timelines or work schedules, but by the state of his body and long stretches of silence. His health did not collapse from a single event, but wore down over many years. The injuries from the earlier accident never fully disappeared. The persistent pain forced him to continue relying on medication, and alcohol was no longer a social habit, but became part of how he maintained his daily state. His body no longer responded as it once had. His heartbeat became unstable. His strength gradually declined, and signs of exhaustion became increasingly evident. There was little information made public, no official explanations, only quiet changes in the way he existed, less present, slower, and gradually fading from public view. In July 1966, he was found dead in his apartment in New York at the age of 45. There was no major event accompanying it, no dramatic moment recorded. The cause was determined to be a heart attack, ending a long process of decline that had largely taken place outside public observation. He died alone, within the space that had become familiar with isolation in the preceding years. The funeral took place quietly, without the nature of a large public event. Attendance was limited, media coverage was not widespread, and there were no prolonged images lasting for days, as Hollywood often handled the death of a star. The contrast became clear when placed beside shocking deaths such as James Dean's, where the public reacted immediately and intensely. Here, everything closed in a different way, without noise, without prolongation, much like the way he had gradually stepped away from the center before. After he was gone, what remained was not measured in quantity or in milestones that could be counted, but in a change that was not immediately visible, yet irreversible. Montgomery Clift shifted the way people understood a man on screen. Certainty, dominance, and control were no longer the only standard. In their place were silences, hesitations, internal fractures allowed to exist without needing to be concealed. A person could be weak, conflicted, incomplete, and that was precisely what made them real. That influence did not end with his generation. Faces such as Marlon Brando or James Dean carried this approach further, but its trace had already appeared earlier, in the way Clift allowed emotion to exist without explanation. There was no longer a clear boundary between character and person, no fixed model to cling to, but a state that was always shifting, always capable of diverging from what was expected. What he left behind was not a list, but a way of seeing, a way for people on screen to carry their own imperfections without being forced into a complete image. And it is within those incomplete spaces that viewers began to recognize something closer, that truth does not lie in what is clearly shown, but in what still cannot be named. Some people do not leave traces in ways that can be immediately seen. They do not remain long enough to be defined by a fixed image, do not conclude with a complete story, and do not stay in memory in a way that is easy to grasp. They pass through, shift something, then disappear. But that shift continues to exist quietly in the way others see the world afterward. Montgomery Clift did not leave behind a model to be repeated. He left behind a space where what is imperfect, unstable, and difficult to name can still exist without needing to be corrected. And that space is the hardest thing to replace. This story does not end with an answer, but stops in an open state where each person will see something different from the same journey. Now, if you want me to continue exploring characters like this, people who do not follow a familiar straight path, leave your thoughts, share your perspective, and don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next stories.